Okay, we are live. Hi, everybody. I am Jenna Blum. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze with my fabulous novelist friend Caroline Levitt and our team of 20 creative volunteers. And today I'm here with you for a very, very special interview with Tori Whitaker, who is the author of this, I have taught you well already, of this amazing debut novel. It's historical fiction called Millicent Glenn's Last Wish, which I have had the great privilege of reading as an editor in early incarnations, and I am so excited to share with you. So Tori, welcome. Thank you for spending your launch with us and sharing the debut novel with us.
I'm just thrilled to be here, especially with you, Jenna. I mean, we kind of go back a ways, and I'm so amazed at what you've done with A Mighty Blaze, and it's so inspiring, and all of those people doing the social media and scheduling authors and everything. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope my whole team could hear that, because they are an amazing team. I'm definitely not doing this alone, although I sit alone with my yoga pants on in my apartment doing a lot of the social media. But every once in a while I get to put on lipstick and come and talk to authors, and that is my favorite part. So I have so many questions I want to ask about your decor and about your necklace, lipstick, but I'm going to try and refrain from the girly stuff just for now.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit, tell us the thumbnail of what I keep calling her Millie, because to me she's Millie. But what is Millicent Glenn's Last Wish about?
Yes. Well, it's my debut book, and Millicent Glenn opens the story when she's 90 years old, and it's a dual timeline story, one of those that goes back and forth between past and present. And she's 90, she's pretty spry for her age, and she gets surprised when her 60-some-year-old daughter, Jane, shows up unannounced. Jane has lived away for 20 years, and they don't get along that well. But Jane says she's moving back to Cincinnati, and that's where the story is set. And then not too long after, Millie's granddaughter, Kelsey, arrives on the scene, and she's 30-some years old, and she announces that she's pregnant. And these two surprises are wonderful surprises for Millie. But yet at the same time, they kind of throw her into memories come rushing back over a period of time, really. And they're always there, but these things are sort of a trigger. And she decides, she's going to be 91 soon, that the girls don't know what her deep, dark secret is. And it's something that happened 60 years before, when she was a young, willful wife and everything. And a tragedy occurs that she feels partly responsible for. And so she's about to tell them and hope that it'll bring them closer, actually, and hope that they'll forgive her. But can she forgive herself? That's, I guess, the story in a nutshell.
That was a great thumbnail sketch of the story. How long did it take you to be able to pitch that? We call it the elevator pitch.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I've done a couple videos on Instagram, so I've kind of gotten used to being able to say it. But if I were to say it, I guess, in one sentence, I would say Millie was a woman from the 1950s post-war baby boom who wanted it all. She wanted a home and a family and a job. She wanted to earn, but society at that time wasn't quite ready for someone that ambitious. And so society kind of put obstacles in her way.
I have the same sort of dilemmas through my characters. I actually love this sort of intersectionality as a writer, when you have a person who is a full developed personality in your own mind, and then you set that person into her context and see how those two things interact. Like, to me, that's really fascinating. And so much of Millicent Glenn's Last Wish is about women making choices in their lives, and how the different eras these three women hearken from affect their choices. So there's this sort of wonderful braid for those of us who love that sort of World War II, immediate post-war era we get to see through the historical window Millie's choices and her personality, her very feisty personality being sculpted by that time and in reaction to that time. And then the contrast with the other two women who come from eras with different expectations. Do you remember like a moment when you had a genesis flashpoint for this story? Like what came to you first? Was it Millie? Was it the interest in the time period? Was it something that I can't even fathom?
Yes, there are several things that sort of came together to inspire me to write this, but there's one memory that I have in the back of my mind from when I was, I guess, roughly 5 years old. And my family had been at this huge family reunion that we went to every year. And I was off going to this like water fountain out in the park where it was held. There were some older cousins, distant cousins who I didn't really know. I couldn't even tell you their names. But I overheard them say something that had happened to one of the women in the family, a relative. And that put a picture in my mind that actually ends up being in the very pivotal scene of this novel. And it's, you know, a spoiler, so we won't talk exactly about what it is, other than to say that that event is in the book and it draws from a tragedy that happened in my family. And as we think about that baby boom era that Millie goes back in her memories to, and the readers get to see it in real time through her eyes and her point of view. The baby boom, I mean, we think of baby boomers, I think, as oftentimes as those people now who are either at or near retirement. But what happened during that period when all those babies were being born, you know, hospitals were overcrowded and things such as that. And so the story makes a connection then in the modern day with granddaughter Kelsey's pregnancy too. There are those similarities, but very different worlds in some ways.
It's a really great answer. Is it giving too much away to say that the novel is very much about motherhood and the ways people become mothers and the choices that they make and then the toll that that exacts upon them?
I know, I think that's a fair statement. And
Good, 'cause I already said it. So if it was a secret.
motherhood, yeah, exactly. No, I love it.
Right.
It I I also come from a 5-generation family, just as a side note. And then when my grandchildren were born, we had 5 generations again, which is pretty uncommon. And so that whole generational thing and what we pass down from one generation to another. I mean, I'm already conscious of the kinds of things I might be passing to my own granddaughter, who's 12 years old. And so, yeah, mother-daughter, mother-granddaughter definitely plays in. Interestingly, and I think you'll relate to this because you read early chapters. You are a teacher of fiction, and I reached out to you a couple years ago. And so, you know that that mother-daughter thing was, I thought it was going to be like fun to write, like say some friction between mother and daughter, but that was actually really hard for me. I remember years ago, started writing this book like 5 years ago, and up in, you know, till those years, I remembered my mother saying, you know, I'm so glad our family gets along because it's not like that with all families, you know. And so I thought it would be fun to write a mother-daughter where there was some friction. And it was kind of fun, but it was harder than I thought it would be. And you, among the other editors I've worked with, have stretched me to put some more conflict in there between the two.
Okay. So full disclosure, everybody, I did work on early drafts of Millicent Glenn's Last Wish, so I kind of feel about it like it's my baby too. I get super attached to the books that I work on. I do consulting, manuscript consulting through Grub Street Writers, who I also teach for. And Tori reached out to me, and I still remember like so vividly, you know, when you have a book you love and you know where you were when you read it. Yes. So because I read this book a couple of different times, maybe 3 or 4 different times, I want to say, I still remember sitting in my study next door and reading it during a certain season, or I would take it to my favorite coffee shop and read it and sit there for several hours and just get lost in the time periods that the book offers, and especially the 50s. Like when I pictured the book as the finished copy, which I now I'm like so happy I get to hold hold it. I was picturing it with these colors on the cover.
Are you kidding
It
me?
was sort of very retro, you know, very, I think I even wrote this to you in my comments at one point, like they're going to put like a woman in sort of retro dress on the cover and this sort of mint blue green color, which is also on the wall of your office in a different shade. Like I was so pleased with it. And I think that people who love The Memory Keeper's Daughter, like it had a very similar sensibility to me in terms of really digging into people's choices and how they affect them and the secrets that they keep around choices they're ashamed of. Also just like that luscious historical detail. And I want to ask you about that. But first I have to make a comment, which is you mentioned that you have a granddaughter who's 12. Like you are one hot grandma lady.
I know.
I mean, like what? I don't even believe you.
Oh, thank you.
Did you have?
I might have started young, you know.
I was gonna say you must have had your kids when you were like 11. I mean, of course, I stalk you on Facebook, so I know you have this beautiful family. I just saw a picture of your sons for Son's Day, and
you're so sweet. And I want to say something to you too. That your book.
Oh, boom!
You didn't know I was gonna pull this up, did you?
I did not actually.
It's such an inspiration to me. I remember reading it. I remember seeing this in Barnes and Noble and thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to buy this book. And then that first chapter, no spoilers, but when I got to the garbage bags, I was like, I cannot put this book down. Okay. And again, your book too was about secrets and that those dual time periods and the mother-daughter discovery and the secrets coming out. And so truly, it was an early inspiration for the kinds of books that I love and the kind of book that I wanted to try to write.
Oh, thank you so much. That means the world to me. I actually literally had goosebumps.
Oh, so when you first read mine, which I was so nervous reaching out to you through Grub Street, I was like, Jenna Blum. But I saw on your website there that you do some development, some book development. And so I reached out to you. And then when I got your notes the first time, and this is sort of, as you would say, how the sausage is made.
Yes.
But, when I got your notes, the first two paragraphs really blew me away so much that no matter what you said after that, no matter what you thought needed to be further developed or changed, I could take it. I was ready. I was up for it. And I was going to do whatever it took to make my book better because I want my book to be published and I want it in readers' hands, obviously. And so, but when you come out and you say Millicent is unforgettable and that what happens in her life is the kind of fiction that someone will read and never forget it. And all of those things, I literally typed it up in great big font, those first paragraphs, and taped it on my door here in the office so that I would see it every time I came in and out to help inspire me. Because when you dig that deep and you make those kinds of revisions, especially in dual timelines, right? Mm-hmm. It can be hair pulling out type of stuff. You make one change in one era and then you've got to make the change in the other era to get the chapters to flow. But I really feel like I'm here today partly because of your help.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It's so inspiring. And you will find this out now as your book goes out into the world. The reason I have goosebumps is not just from your kindness, but you always wonder as a writer when you're sitting alone in your office, what part of yourself that you're throwing out there might catch on people. Mm-hmm. And it's a great privilege to hear, like you mentioned, there's the set of garbage bags in the prologue of my first book. And,
among many things.
Writing that would be something that a reader would hold on to or that would hook them in. So you just never know. And you also never know when you're really trying to imagine the inner landscape of a character and the circumstances of his or her life. What about that world is a reader going to enter into and then come away with? So it's a great privilege to be able to put the stories out into the world. I'm privileged to be a part of your story. All of us have editors who become parts of our stories or guides or mentors, and I'm really grateful. But I think it's true. I mean, Millie to me is like my grandma, except a Cincinnati version of my grandma, my grandma was born in Minnesota. But There are these ladies who, you know, had spine and spunk and could present as being very elegant on the surface, but you know, there was like some fireworks going on in the inside. And I always wished
Yes.
that I had known my grandmother at a simultaneous age, so I could have known her as a young woman. And what we have are these stories. So are any of Millie's stories, and you mentioned this sort of salacious detail of, you know, overhearing a family story at a picnic. Were any of the other stories in the novel that are, I mean, there's a lot of shocking stuff in this novel, people. It's really juicy. You have to buy it and read it. But are there any other things that you sort of took
Well,
from your life?
there are a lot of memories that bubbled up because I set the story in Cincinnati, where I was born, and I'm down in Georgia now. But I lived in Ohio until I was 10, and Jocelyn Jackson, another teacher that I've had, I took a class with her. She once said that when you're writing and you want sense of place, if you have a visceral connection to the place, then it will lend more meaning. And I found that to be true, because as I was writing, I would have these memories of things that were just back there that I wasn't conscious. It's not like I sat down and said, okay, now I'm going to write about this memory. And so it could be things that happened with my father when we went to the Union Terminal, which is a scene in the book, and the Whispering Fountains. That's a pretty important scene. This is where Millie learns something from Jane and Kelsey that ultimately is going to change the trajectory of their relationships and how it affects her. And it's news to Millie that is set somewhere that I really was. And then there are other scenes, whether it's the ice cream shop or things like that. But I'm not thinking offhand of something else that is a direct experience or something I've heard that goes into it. It'll probably hit me, all these things, when we get off, but
you can always go and put them in the Facebook thread, and readers will go and glean
oh
them.
yeah, oh yes.
Oh, I remember that, in the shower. Oh, right, that's what I meant to say. It does sound like a magic symbiosis.
Oh, I'm thinking one just as we're saying. Oh my gosh,
Good.
there is one part. So when Millie goes to the hospital to deliver Jane, and this was in, like, I think 1949 or 1950, I had her going up the elevator at the hospital in a wheelchair and then being pushed into a room where she has to get the prep, and the prep being a shave and an enema. And those kinds of things, I remember when I first gave birth, even in the late 70s and early 80s, that, I mean, that I remembered acutely. So that kind of, I mean, I didn't go into great detail there, but it's more the dread of it happening.
Yes. I mean, it's such the attitudes toward childbirth shift from generation to generation. Obviously, we've experienced this in our own lives, and then we get to see it replicated so faithfully there. But that, I mean, it's a terrifying loss of control feeling, I think, anyway, right? That you're just going to go into this experience, you don't know how it's going to go, and then at a time when women were forced to be sort of cleaned up for that experience, it sounds extra taxing. So that's a great example. And I love the juiciness of the book. As I said, like, there are things in here you will not forget, readers. Like, you will not forget. There are scenes that will stick with you. It's not just Millie's voice in your ear, which I still have, because it's like sitting down with your grandma to hear her tell stories about her life, but also just like there's some really dark stuff, which I, as a reader, love, and as a writer, explore as well. But I also was charmed by, you mentioned the Whispering Fountain in Cincinnati and Union Station, and I was very charmed by the settings in this book. I love sense of place. I think place shapes a person. I think of place as a person when I'm writing. Can you tell us about the Whispering Fountains, and then maybe why Cincinnati, like what ties you have and what you love about it? Like, what's your favorite place there?
Oh, okay. Well, Union Terminal or Union Station is really one of my favorite places. But what you do when you go into this huge big terminal, it's like the largest half-dome terminal in the world or something like that. It used to be a train station built in 1933, but they're still using it now. And it's the hub of Cincinnati's museums and everything, even though it still has trains going through it. And it's Art Deco. And when you go in, there are these fountains, water drinking fountains, one way in one corner and one way in the other corner, 180 feet apart. And when you bend over and sip of water, or pretend like you're going to sip of water into one of these fountains, and somebody's doing it in the other one, you can speak and hear and talk and have a conversation. It's like this trick of the dome, some kind of scientific thing I can't explain, but I remember my father doing that with my brother and me when we were young. And then my husband and I went there when I was doing research for the book, and we tried it. I mean, they still work. I can't wait to get my grandchildren there. They're just so cool. But Cincinnati also, and I learned this, even though I had family from there, I didn't really know. And I was in Ohio in 4th grade when we had Ohio history, you know, how all 4th graders have state history. But I didn't learn then that Cincinnati used to be a real hub for the brewing industry in the 1800s and into the 1900s until Prohibition totally decimated that industry. But what's happening now in the city is, in the last several years, is that they've brought back, they're doing sort of an homage to the German brewing history, industry history there. And so there's all kinds of breweries and bars and craft beers, if you're into that kind of thing. And it's really cool. And Cincinnati is also on the river, and it's got a lot of history that goes back to, you know, another decade with the paddle boats, and you can still see some of those if you go to the city. And I love it. I still feel a lot of my heart is there for sure.
That's so lovely. I know about the sort of, I think of them as the forgotten cities, but they're the big industrial cities of that era. Milwaukee is the same way. I had a great book event there with a woman named Margie Stratton a few years ago, and got to stay downtown in Milwaukee. And I thought, nobody told me, like, this is like the country's best kept secret. It's so beautiful. There are all of these movies. The Art Deco architecture is fantastic. There's an art museum there that's like, you know, really unparalleled, gorgeous structure. And I feel as though those big industrialist cities where the robber barons lived have so much American history, and it's so palpable. It hasn't been changed that much. So you can go to these big Midwestern places and feel the history tangibly. And you said you did this with your husband when you were researching. Can you tell us a little bit more about the research for Millie? I love to ask this question with historic.
Yes. Well, part of the research that we did when we went there was this whole prefabricated homes. In the book, Millie and her husband start a business of prefabricated homes, which are not like mobile homes. They're prefab homes are homes that are shipped in a kit. They arrive on the driveway with all these numbered and colored pieces, from the roof to the windows to the picket fence, really, literally. And prefab home builders can put them up in 1 week. This was important during that post-war period because construction had pretty much shut down during the war, when everybody was off fighting. And then when the servicemen came home, there was a housing shortage, and everybody was trying to get back to prosperity after not only the war, but the Depression and the crash, and, you know, all these things they'd lived through. And so they're getting married and they're having families and they're going back to work, and they needed homes. So I interviewed an expert in prefabricated homes, and he actually gave me addresses of where these houses still exist today. And so my husband, John, and I just really loved, you know, we took these addresses, used GPS, and we're going all around looking at these homes that were built that like Millie and Dennis might have built. And I loved it. And even though some of them have been somewhat renovated, they're still holding strong. They're real homes on real foundations. And yet by the early 60s, that whole trend was gone. You know, there might still be some going on, but basically the whole real trend was gone. But I mean, Sears Catalog used to have homes.
I
where
was
you
just
buy
gonna
a
say,
kit and
years.
put it up a home. So it's something that's very to the period, and I hadn't seen that used in a story before among the books that I've read. And it really, I thought, was one thing that made it different, but also kind of ties into Millie, because at one point she begins to think, but wait, is this all good? You know, like for example, I have copies of real brochures for the real Gunnison Homes home building company that existed at that time. And the ads are just fascinating. I mean, like the home being man's greatest gift to women. That's in the book and that's real. And she's like, okay. And then it would have sections like, this section is for husbands, this section brochure. This is for husbands, this is for wives, and they're very different.
That's so fascinating. And Millie is a little bit ahead of her time in that way, and having this very independent spirit and questioning some of these things. And it's such an interesting thing to watch her push back against circumstance, and then to see circumstance kind of push back at her.
But Jenna, I love how we know this, because when you were helping me, you asked, why is Millie like this? You asked. And her mother was already in the story. And they have this impoverished background because her family in the story, her father and her grandfather had been in the brewing industry. And so they lost everything in Prohibition. And that was when Millie was a little girl. Although that happened, they lost everything before she was born, but she's living with the fallout of it still, you know, in the slums of a part of Cincinnati. And you asked me, why is she like this? And you said you need to add a scene where Millie's mother conveys to her this this theme that goes throughout the book of why Millie is driven and why Millie wants to have a job of her own. And it's actually my favorite scene of the book right now. I mean,
so
it's a scene where, and I think you'll probably remember it. And it's not too much of a spoiler to say this, but it's a scene where Millie is like 6 years old, and she's in this attic of this tenement building with her penniless mother, and they're doing the laundry because all the women had to take turns going up to this attic. They all had their day a week to go up and do their attic in the old zinc tubs, the washing, the rinsing, the hanging along the lines. And I spoke with a historian in Cincinnati who told me this is how they did it in the tenements. But this is the scene where her mother tells her the things that will carry with Millie for the whole of her life. And it's so special to me. You helped inspire this scene. And I found when I wrote it, I was really able to dig into it. And it's really one that still resonates with me because it has such a powerful impact on her throughout her life.
I remember the scene vividly, and it wasn't just because I told you to write it. I'm very bossy, people, like if you will, extremely bossy. And the better I get to know a writer and we form a mutual admiration society and respect, the more bossy I get. Like, look, butts off.
Tell me what to do. I loved it.
And I'm like, okay, I will. But no, I love that.
As a writer, if you do have something that you feel really strongly about, at one point you were not necessarily feeling the zoo scene with the gorilla. Remember?
That scene, yes.
And twice I came back and I'm like, but you know, I really want to keep this scene. But what needed to be done was I needed to make it so relevant to the story, not just somewhere they go, you know? And I think eventually I got an email from you. It was like, I love the zoo scene. I love the gorilla.
Yes, because we figured out a way to plug it in emotionally. So much of what you're talking about is, and I want people to hear this very vivid research that gets incorporated into the book in this lush, visceral detail that you can feel and smell, hear, as well as
that was research too. That gorilla, that particular gorilla named Susie, really existed.
Like,
In the zoo, which is the second oldest zoo in the country.
so when you read this book, you can, like, Tori's joy in replicating these details for you, but also living in her characters' bodies through these details is so palpable in the book. So you feel as though you go somewhere, you go to a different place, you go to a different time. I think really good historical fiction has to do two things. It has to take you to that different place and time in a really transporting and immersive way, which you do. And it also has to place you squarely in somebody else's body and experience and mind within that different place and time, which you also do. So the historical novelist has two things that she's constantly toggling, the place and the time, and then the character and the emotions. Do you have, after such an intense experience writing this book, researching it, obviously putting a lot of love into it, a lot of energy, do you have postpartum now? Do you miss your girls?
I haven't gotten that yet. The book officially released today, actually, because it happened to be chosen as one of Amazon's pre-publication promotions. So it's been out in Kindle for a few weeks, but this is the first time people are going to get to hold the book in their hands starting today, and Audible too. But I haven't had the postpartum yet, but it could happen. All I know is that this book is forever a big part of my heart. I don't mind letting listeners and other readers and writers know that it's the third book I've written. And the first two did not get published. And it's not unusual in the industry for writers to have, the proverbial couple books in a drawer. And certainly I did. And it took me a long time to write these books too, because I also have a full-time job and I worked during the day. So my journey to publication was long, and something I did during my evenings and my weekends and our vacation time. And I've got a wonderful husband who's been super supportive, and he cried when he read it. And,
oh my gosh, is he the inspiration for Dennis? Because he's such a good guy.
in some ways he is. Yeah. I will say this though, that's something very different about my husband and Dennis, and that is that he had a business early in our marriage for about 10 years, and I worked with him there, but he was always very encouraging of me then, of my going to get an education, of my career. He's always been very supportive. And Dennis, there's a period when Millie and he started a family and they had the children that he's not so supportive of that. But in other ways, yeah, there are some similarities. My husband does have blue eyes and dimples. Interestingly, my husband also, being a child of the 50s and 60s, volunteered gosh, it must have been 1968 or so. He volunteered to go to Vietnam, but he discovered he had a high frequency hearing loss when he went, and they, he didn't pass a physical. And Dennis had that happen to him too. Although it wasn't Vietnam, it was World War II.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yes.
Again, that sort of.
I guess there's another thing that happened from real life when you asked me about it.
Now,
earlier, I couldn't think of all these things, but that is something, yes.
That is so interesting. And any of you who are involved with writers, you know that even despite our better angels on our shoulders, we can't help combing through our lives and your lives to borrow some of those details, because that's what it's all about. People's stories are really what is the most interesting. I think that's another job that a novelist has who writes about historical events, is you teach yourself the events, you do the research, and then you really have to keep your eyes on the story and people's stories and what makes the characters like fully three-dimensional and human.
Yeah, and it's those kind of things that aren't necessarily in the outline. It's just, I'm writing the scene where Dennis and Millie have met at Coney Island, which is the amusement park in Cincinnati. They happen to name it Coney Island there too. And it's on the Ohio River, and he is on farmer's deferment because his family own a farm, and he didn't get to go to to fight, and he wanted to go, you know, overseas and everything. So he went and volunteered anyway, even though he was on Farmers Deferment. And they said, you're really doing something important, because farmers are growing the crops that are sustaining the troops, and not just our troops. Back during that time, they were sustaining the troops in England, you know, the British troops too, because so much was going on in Europe and across, you know, UK. And so it's just one of those little connections.
Yes, I love that. And all the filaments that the past throws to the present and then to the future. I was thinking about farmers while you were talking. And I'm wondering, since you spend time in these very lush periods of history, do you feel nostalgia for them when you come out of it into our current era? And what do you feel about what's going on now? And how does your sort of understanding of history affect that feeling?
Yes. I do feel close to the 1950s. I found that even though I was born in 1958, so you know, even in the early 60s, some of the foods that we talk about in the book, or I talk about in the book, are things that I ate growing up, for example. I you know, interestingly, I think there is definitely a thread of a theme of feminism through this book. Strong women having the right to work, and yet I feel like women should have the right to stay in the home and be a full-time homemaker too, which is something I personally did for a long time before I started my career. I think my kids were like 10 and 13 or something like that when I really started the career that I have now. And so I think it is a choice. And what we see Kelsey going through is, well, Kelsey in the book, she's 38 years old, she's pregnant, she's married, and she's trying to decide, will she continue her job? And she's got more choices. She's got more options than Millie ever had. But will she get, you know, work part-time? Will she be able to work from home? Will she go back to work after the baby's born full-time, or stay home full-time? These are things that she's wrestling with. And we see in her arc, by the end of the book, we will know what she's going to choose to do. And that was another tip you gave me, which is Jane, the daughter, and Kelsey, the granddaughter, have to be characters in their own right. That while the story has its own arc, and certainly Millie does, it's the whole book, both narratives, past and present, are told through her eyes, her point of view. But the other characters, the other two women, have to have their own mini arcs too.
We have this saying in my novel workshop for Grub Street. Whitney Scherer, who's an amazing novelist whose debut, The Age of Light, is
I love that book.
incandescent. I'm so glad. But when we talk about arc in the class, and now we do class on Zoom, so in the chat she writes, and you get an arc, and you get an arc, and everybody gets an arc, because yeah, all the characters have to have the arcs. And we talk about plot arc, we talk about character arc, we talk about somebody was writing a book in which there was a magic object, and that object had to have an arc. So it has become sort of this silly catchphrase. But I love that you mentioned this, because I feel as though you're giving writers a lot of tips and encouragement in our talk. Christina Baker-Klein, who's another historical author who I love, is doing this thing every Wednesday now that she calls Writing Tip Wednesday. So all of you writers can go to her Facebook page and see her writing tips, which is so great.
I haven't tried that yet.
Yeah, well, she just did it.
Orphan Train, and she's got the new book out, The
Exiles. Yep. So she's out there. She taught me about a ring light too, which so I'm like very indebted to.
Oh, that's why you look like you do.
That's why I'm like, you know, even looking. I'll hook you up, girl. So I have a couple of last questions for you before we have to wrap up. And one of them is, you mentioned how you wrote this book after being a homemaker, staying home full-time, raising your kids, starting a second career, and now you have this new career as a novelist. What would you say to novelists who are trying to get that first book published?
Two things that I think were the difference for me, that this book found a publisher. and the first two didn't. Aside from just learning as I go. I mean, you learn and you learn and you learn, and then you learn something new, like secondary character needs the arc. But having a critique group, and I came out of Jocelyn Jackson's course, and she said, if you do nothing else in this class, come out with a critique group. And so there were other historical fiction writers in this course, and we've been meeting every month religiously for 2 years, or no, maybe, I think it's 3 years. And they're writing historical fiction now as well. And I found I learned as much from reading their work as I did from them critiquing mine. And so if there's someone you can trust in that way, and then you become so bonded, oh my gosh, with your critique group. I mean, they're not just your critique partners, they're your friends and your confidants and your cheerleaders and your psychiatrists, you know? And then the second thing is work with a good developmental editor. And a lot of authors do that these days as they're trying to get to publication, and perhaps even after they have had a book out or even multiple books out. And so that's what you do, and that's what I found in you. And so, yeah, I would say if you can, as a aspiring author, do those two things. Get feedback on your work.
Amazing. And I do think that's true. There's such a band of brothers or band of sisters or both effect when you're going through the writing of a book, which takes a long time, people, for most of us. And you have people who believe in your characters the same way they believe in real people, and vice versa. There's something that is, so bonding about that my writing group here in Boston is like my family. I call them my fam. And in fact, most of the people who work on The Blaze are from my writing workshop that I teach and who I will share my work with. So, I mean, you just get to be so incredibly close because the writing of a book is such an emotional process. It's like you're like, making a sneaker or something.
And they know what you're going through because they're going through it too. If you're struggling with a scene or chapters or arcs.
The arcs. And I mean, everybody always struggles. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this as a debut, but every time you start a book, you go back to square one. So you might have some.
I've heard that. I've heard that the sophomore novel is just as bad as the first. I'm like,
oh, sophomore. I mean, there's an anecdote about Amy Tan being at a reading after Joy Luck Club came out, and that was her first book. And when they did audience Q&A, somebody said to her, Amy, how does it feel to have written your best book first? And she actually had to get like 4 new crowns because she was grinding her teeth so much in her sleep after being asked that question, working on her sophomore novel. So that's a sort of apocryphal story that I think of when people tell me, oh my gosh, the second one is really hard. But I've also seen the opposite be true, that I've seen the first one be a big struggle, and then the writer gains confidence with the second one. So I think it's such an individual process, and I can't wait to read. What are you working on now? Are you working on something?
I am. I can't tell too much about it, but I will say this, that it is another dual timeline story. It goes back and forth between past and present. And in Millicent's story, I was inspired somewhat by Prohibition. I did some tertiary sort of research on it for this book. But the next book is going to go back into Prohibition era, not in Cincinnati. I'm not going to say where, but it's dual timeline with historical and Prohibition and contemporary family drama, of course, and secrets.
Of course. What would a book be without a secret? It would be an open book. It would be really boring.
Secrets.
We love our secrets here on The Blaze. We love our in novels. In real life, they can be a bit wearisome. So excited to read the next one. Do you think you're going to keep writing historical novels about families? Is this kind of like your stripe?
I think it probably is. Yeah. Author brand, as my publisher likes to say. But I can't predict what could happen down the road. But I am So, I mean, the joy about past and present is you get that historical fix and then you get that contemporary fix too. So it's sort of the best of both worlds. But I've always loved history. I came to history really before I came to writing. And I remember the day that I fell in love with history. And I was 5 years old and I was at a museum with my grandparents. And I just, even in fifth grade, and my mom will appreciate this. My dad said, so we're going to go on family vacation and we're going to ask you, where would you like to go? And, you know, I'm this little girl growing up in Indiana in fifth grade. And what would most kids say? Maybe like Disneyland or something? I said, I want to go to Jamestown, Virginia. And that's where we went.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And that was because of your trip to the museum with your grandparents?
No, that was a whole different thing. The one I went to with my grandparents was the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, Michigan. But I had learned in fifth grade, I had learned about Jamestown, and it's like, oh, that's where I want to go.
Oh, I love it. So you are plugged into the past.
I love history.
All of those layers. That's so amazing. And obviously, you guys, Tori is a great storyteller. You can hear it in the anecdotes that she tells about the writing and the researching of Millie. I'm just going to keep calling it Millie, but it's actually MILLICENT GLENN'S Last Wish. You should all order several copies. It's on Audible.
And what you're doing for writers and authors and readers.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we are so, so happy to have you on The Blaze. If you have one thing that you could say to your world of new readers now who are just on the threshold of discovering you and your work, what would you say?
I feel a little emotional with that question all of a sudden, to be honest with you, because you spend so much time, me, right here in this chair, at this computer, in this office, writing all these years. But you don't know until the book gets in readers' hands what it's like to have that experience. Because my book has been out in Kindle for, you know, a few weeks, and there's advanced reader copies, and so there are readers and bloggers and reviewers who have already read my story. And what I didn't know until I experienced it is what a joy it is to connect with readers. You know, I've gone to author events for about 6 years. You know, I've come to 2 of yours. And I know what it's like to be a reader. I didn't know what it was like to have a reader tell me how much they love my book. And it's really special.
Oh my gosh, you're making me cry too. I knew we would use the Kleenex at some point. You know, I like to make people
cry. I
don't
think I've ever seen anybody else cry on their first Zoom.
Oh no, they do. But, I make all the writers cry.
Readers that have just, it's been amazing.
Tori, no, there's nothing better. I just love that you said that so much. So everybody, obviously you see how much Tori cares about her work and loves her readers. Please give the book some love. It's MILLICENT GLENN'S Last Wish. It's a great book. It's a great book.
I love it. Enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Oh my God, I literally have goosebumps. I'll like put my arm right up next to I love it. Thank you so much for bringing us your love and your light and your book.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you for everything.
You're so, so welcome. And good luck. Good luck.
Okay, thank you.